Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming out on such a stormy evening. My name is Ray Perman. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in our series of Politicians and Professionals 2016. The context this year, of course, being the Scottish Parliament elections in May. And we're delighted tonight to have our speaker, Patrick Harvie, the leader of the Green Party in the Scottish Parliament, who will speak to us in a moment. Again, we are very grateful for the support of the professional organisations, ICAS, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the Faculty of Advocates, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and again, very grateful to have the support of the Young Academy in Scotland, and I will call on a member of the Young Academy to talk about their work right at the end of the evening. But now I'm going to hand over to Patrick, and after Patrick has spoken, Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, will chair the question and answer afterwards. So I will hand over now to Patrick Harvie.
Well, thank you very much, Ray, and thank you for the invitation once again to come and speak. I think, you can probably tell me if you saw all of the speeches last year. I suspect mine was the least rehearsed, and it might be, again, the least rehearsed or the least pre-written. I tend to work off notes and riff off some material that I've used in the past, so I'm going to try and do the same thing again and cast it very much in terms of the agenda and the challenges that I think are going to be facing not just the Green Party in this election, but Scotland over the coming 5-year term of the Scottish Parliament. And we're doing this, obviously, at a time that's terrifically exciting for all politics watchers, because it's 100 days to go, and all the political parties have been out doing what a few months out tend to be slightly contrived photo ops, trying to excite everybody in the street, some of whom haven't really noticed yet that there's an election going on. There'll be many people who take a while to get engaged in the process over the next few months, and I really hope that we can get the same level of participation in the election that we managed to achieve in the referendum a year and a bit back. I'd have to say it's depressing to have to acknowledge that it is unlikely to achieve that level of participation. And I think in many ways that reflects a disconnect that people still have with politics. A referendum, after all, was always going to be a nice, clear, easy, simple decision, a yes or no choice, whichever side of that debate you fell down on, it really mattered, and you could see why it really mattered. An election with a bigger range of options and opinion polling that might seem to suggest it's on something less than a knife edge, it may be harder to engage so many people to take part, to participate, not just by voting, but by asking questions and setting out what they want from their politicians. But I do hope that all political parties will be giving their best effort to make this an engaging and a stimulating debate. The Scottish Green Party is engaging in it at a tremendously exciting time in our own development. We're going to be going into this election with nearly 10 times the membership that we had in the last Scottish Parliament election. We'd been growing gradually through the European campaign, and then during the referendum, and then post-referendum, we got this extraordinary surge of members, the vast majority of whom have chosen to stay with us and renewed their membership more than a year on. And so we're gearing up to turn all of that new activism into campaigning capacity. There are branches that have developed over the last year and a half around Scotland, some of them in more local communities where bigger branches were trying to cover a large territory, and some of them in areas of Scotland where we didn't have much presence on the ground at all. Greens have very often seen some really exciting poll numbers in the run-up to an election, particularly Scottish Parliament elections with a slightly fairer voting system than Westminster. And sometimes that's failed to emerge in the ballot box in terms of X's on pieces of paper. And one of the things that we've always put that down to is the lack of campaigning capacity. Well, we don't have that excuse any longer. We've got the ability to get out there and to take the message directly to the Scottish electorate and explain why a Green vote can make a real difference and make the Scottish Parliament bolder on a wide range of policies where we think the government needs to be pushed to go a wee bit beyond its comfort zone. Because as even some SNP members and seasoned activists have been acknowledging recently, it's not healthy for any party to feel that the votes are in the bag already and that a built-in majority is their natural status quo and that they're not being challenged, constructively challenged, but challenged. And I think constructive challenge has always been part of what the Green Party is about, challenging the status quo about how we do our politics, but how we organise our society and our economy as well, and offering that challenge in the spirit of hope that something better is possible. We do still have stereotypes to overcome. Stereotypes of perhaps being a single-issue party. I think that's less true of ourselves than of more or less any political party. I constantly go to meetings of the European Green Party and meet people from other Green parties around the EU, and I'm constantly struck by the number of policies that are, on a surface level, quite far from the core environmental agenda that many people associate us with, but on which Greens have never coordinated but simply arrived at a similar position. I think there is a core underlying philosophy that unites Green parties and brings us broadly toward a similar set of political agendas, economic agendas and social agendas. But the stereotype of a single-issue party, I think, clearly isn't something to be afraid of, given that it's clearly demonstrated in Scottish politics now that you can be a single-issue party. You can be a party that has members from the hard right to the hard left and everything in between and be united on one single principle and come to be incredibly dominant. There's nothing to be afraid of in being a single-issue party, very clearly. Sometimes we're accused of being prophets of doom. That's another stereotype that we're labelled with. The oceans are dying, the climate crisis is upon us, the oil's running out, take to the hills, everyone. The end is coming. Well, far from it. I think if I genuinely believed that our goose was cooked as a civilization, I'd be doing something a lot less tiring with my life. I'd probably be sleeping later in mornings and partying harder in the evenings and having a bit more time to myself. The only reason we do this, the only reason we try to bring a green perspective into the political arena is because we believe there is hope. We're prophets of hope rather than of doom. We're here to say that a change is not only necessary, not only coming, but is actually desirable and can lead to a better quality of life for all of us. And sometimes another stereotype that's thrown at us is that we're not at all concerned with the economy. Yes, it would be terribly nice if we had better climate change policies, but can we really afford them when times are tough? A green agenda at its core is an economic analysis of the world out of kilter with the environmental limits, the recognition that the environment is a wholly owned subsidiary, that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. Shouldn't have got that one round the wrong way, should I? That this is fundamentally about the economic relationship between human activity and the resources that we depend upon and the space that we inhabit and all of the other life systems that we share that space with. Last year when I spoke, I think I used because I don't write the speeches down, I probably am misremembering this, but I think I used the analogy of Cassandra. Blessed, if you see it that way, with the gift of prophecy, but cursed with the fate never to be believed in those prophecies. And there have been times when the Green movement has felt that way, whether from the original foundational agendas like limits to growth or the Club of Rome, the idea of peak oil, which is very often misunderstood and misrepresented, or indeed with the first attempts to bring a political analysis to bear on the science of climate change. Very often the Green movement has felt as though we have a prophecy that we're utterly seized by, and a confidence that this is a critical agenda, but feel that we're no longer, or not yet being believed. I think these days things have moved on. If you look at the recognition that the world has, unless you are the US Republican Party, and they genuinely do stand out like a sore thumb, even amongst right-wing conservative political parties around the world, apart from that one major exception, the vast majority of the world's political mainstream accepts the basics of climate science and uses words like sustainability. We know what's happening. And so perhaps the analogy now is more about Augustine. Those famous words, "Lord, make me chaste, but please, Lord, not yet." The recognition that we do need to change, that change is not only something that has to come from within, but is something which is coming from external forces as well, change which is coming whether we like it or not, but that we're not really geared up yet, we're not really ready yet, we're not really prepared yet. And this, I think, is the condition that Scotland is in at the moment. Change is coming, and we are not prepared for it, but we could be. I think the recognition has to be as well that this is not just a political failing. This is there in our media. A great deal of our responsible media does now recognise the basics of climate science, of wider environmental challenges. But if you look at some of the biggest sellers, you see, whether in the Daily Mail, whether in the Telegraph, the Express, the Sun, various other, big sellers, you see an appalling diatribe of bunkum, of massively debunked arguments against a green agenda. And it's not enough just to keep saying they're wrong over and over again, because that hasn't changed what they do. They've clearly decided that they have a political intent to plough that furrow and to try and sell papers by it. So there's a cultural aspect to this, not just a political aspect to this failure to be prepared. And it shows itself as well in words like sustainable and sustainability, which too often sound like mere jargon. Too often they're used as mere jargon or window dressing, if you like. Just like words in the name of a country. If you spot the name democratic or peoples in a country, it's a bit of a hint that there might be a wee sign of dictatorship in there somewhere. If you spot the name unity, the word unity in the name of a political party, then probably there's a split involved in how that party came about. So the word sustainable very often comes to be used in the same way. And you don't have to look very far to see claims of sustainable fisheries, which are nothing of the kind, to see claims of sustainable forestry, which are nothing of the kind, claims of sustainable mining, which are nothing of the kind. And at the moment, we have a government in the Scottish Parliament which uses the phrase sustainable economic growth, and has never, after 8 years, I think, of having that mantra at the very top of its political agenda, this pinnacle of its economic indicators, has never come up with a coherent definition of what sustainable economic growth means, other than plain old vanilla GDP growth with a few environmental policies to decorate it at the side. Sustainability isn't like PC, isn't like political correctness. I don't think political correctness is at all a bad thing, by the way. I think it's a much maligned and very decent form of just basic courtesy and politeness in society. But it is about what we should say, how we should speak to one another, how we should behave. Sustainability isn't about should, it's about can and can't. If a form of economic activity is unsustainable, it means it literally cannot last. Not that it shouldn't, not that it's a bad idea, it means that it cannot last. It's about whether it fits within hard limits to our environment, our society, and our economy. So it's not about whether it's preferable. And the case in point that we have to talk about in Scotland over the next few years is the claim that we're going to return to a sustainable oil and gas industry. The impact of job losses that are being felt at the moment and have been for months now in the oil and gas industry and in the wider economy affected by that industry are profound, and no one should diminish them. Very often, in raising the argument for a transition away from oil and gas, we're accused of simply not caring. Far from it. We're arguing for the only course toward a genuinely sustainable economy, an economy which can generate lasting high-quality jobs rather than those that will be here today and gone tomorrow. There are geopolitical aspects to the low oil price at present and what's happening to the industry as a consequence of that. Of course there are. But we need to place those factors in context. There has been a long-term decline in North Sea production. It's well past its first flush. It's clearly in long-term decline. This is to recognise it, not to invite it. Whichever view of you take of the balance between environmental and economic factors in relation to the oil and gas industry, this change is coming, and we do need to prepare. We should be planning for the transition to the next phase of our economic history. And I see very little hint of economic planning in Scotland for the change that's coming. As well as the over-reliance directly for jobs and economic activity, particularly in certain parts of the country like the North East, we also have an over-reliance for our whole society on fossil fuel. Every one of us is wearing clothing, is probably has got items in our pockets, is using devices, perhaps came here on transport, which is dependent on hydrocarbons. Probably every one of us has eaten quite a lot today, which involve hydrocarbons in the production of our food. Our petrochemical industry, pretty much every industry you can think of is dependent on a huge range of chemical feedstocks which derive from hydrocarbons. Now, if we end up not extracting those materials for energy uses, then it becomes highly questionable whether there's an economically viable industry there to extract them for other petrochemical uses as well. So this, again, is a profound challenge to the way that we live, but also a profound opportunity for the development of new industries to look at alternative chemical feedstocks that don't rely on hydrocarbons. And that's something that Scotland could be investing in. Why not? Why wasn't there in that debate about Grangemouth a couple of years back, in that debate about the tussle between the unions and the management, the questions of ownership that were barely even recognised, a critically important piece of our industrial and economic infrastructure, barely even questioned the matter of ownership. But why wasn't there any thought being given to the long-term option of refitting that establishment and reskilling the workforce to be exploring and developing the new industries that are going to have to come, that Scotland could be leading the way on non-hydrocarbon chemical feedstocks? There has been growing warning about a concept called the carbon bubble, which is an additional aspect to the context. We have these arguments around the geopolitics of it. We have the long-term decline in North Sea in Scottish oil and gas production. But the carbon bubble is another critical aspect. And this is something which used to be talked about largely by environmentalists, sometimes by Green Party people. Most recently, a speech by Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, not in front of an audience of activists who were campaigning for fossil fuel divestment, but a bunch of investors and insurers who were genuinely being challenged by this. And in a speech in September last year, Mark Carney made a clear warning that the carbon bubble is a critical risk to financial stability in the UK and that the UK is hugely overexposed. The oil and gas industry is valued as though all of its reserves will be turned effectively into profit. All of its reserves will become economically extracted and put onto the market and boost the long-term future of those companies. Now, the world, according to the IPCC's fifth assessment report, which was the first to include a carbon budget, the world has the opportunity to burn something like a quarter, maybe a third, perhaps only a fifth, of the world's existing reserves of fossil fuels. We've already got substantially more fossil fuel than we can afford to burn if we are remotely serious about that 2-degree target that the whole world has apparently signed up to. That comes back to make me chaste, but not yet. We've agreed that we want to get to this point, but we're not yet recognizing, no country in the world that produces fossil fuels is yet recognizing that most of what we have in existing reserves is literally unburnable. And when that recognition is reached, then we're faced inevitably with the consequence that this is a dramatically overvalued industry. And this is the nature of the carbon bubble. The only question that we have to ask ourselves is not, do we subscribe to this philosophy? Is not, do we think one ideological solution or another is the right path to take? The only question that we have to ask is, how exposed do we want to be to that bubble when it bursts? Because we know what damage economic bubbles do when they burst. And admittedly, the wealthy, the people who are clever enough to achieve that reliance on an economic bubble and gain profit by it, very often manage to sidestep the damage and make sure that that is burdened onto those least responsible for creating the risk in the first place. We've seen that as well. But our whole society will be profoundly challenged if we haven't reduced our reliance on hydrocarbons for energy as well as for other industrial purposes before we reach that point. And all of this, of course, is before Paris, before the Paris Agreement, which moved that target of 2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels to a target, quote, well below 2 degrees and aiming toward 1.5 degrees. What they said was that they were concerned that the greenhouse gas emissions levels that would take place by the mid-2020s and into 2030 that were resulting from the existing commitments of countries around the world don't fall within that 2-degree scenario. Already, we have countries around the world making commitments which are inadequate to reach that 2-degree threshold. And much greater emission reductions are going to be required. But they then went on to say that they have to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, very clearly, a carbon budget which is calculated in line with that 1.5 degree target will be significantly less than the one that's calculated in line with a 2-degree target. And the proportion of it which we've still got available to us, because we've already eaten through a great deal of that budget, the proportion of it that's still available to us will be even more dramatically reduced compared with where we stand at the moment. So the overwhelming conclusion, I would say the inescapable conclusion, is that business as usual is no longer an option. Now, this is an argument that the previous climate change minister in Scotland began to acknowledge after persistent questioning. Paul Wheelhouse, as the climate change minister, asked what proportion of the world's fossil fuels must be left unburned, said, "I don't have a figure to give Mr. Harvie for the percentage of fossil fuels that I would like to see remain under the earth, but I accept the point that if we were to burn all the fossil fuels in the world, we would be doing untold damage." Now, sadly, across many, many speeches over a number of years, the Scottish Government's energy minister has made it clear that he entirely fails to grasp that point. The Scottish Government, the UK Government, and the other opposition parties, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, are all signed up to exactly the same basic strategy on oil and gas that they've had for many years, which is maximum economic extraction. If instead we were to shift that strategy, not from maximum economic extraction, as Fergus Ewing pumps himself up and gets the fire in his eyes talking about another 40 or 50 years of oil and gas extraction. Instead, look at extraction over a shorter period and maximize the revenue to the public purse over that shorter period, recognizing that most of the existing reserves ultimately are not going to be extracted. Then we have the opportunity to invest in the transition which is required, to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and to invest in economic alternative industries which can grow and be with us not just for those 40 or 50 years, actually it wouldn't last that long, but industries that can be with us for the long term. And in fact, the process of economic change is already upon us as well. I think you don't need to look far amongst the entrepreneurial community, not only to see a willingness to acknowledge the challenges of climate change and live up to them. As my colleague Caroline Lucas told the Westminster Parliament in debating the energy bill, talked about the entrepreneurs' call to climate action, a joint statement from 121 CEOs with international operations. In their words, the technology and business models already exist for 100% fossil-free solutions, as opposed to a slightly better alternative of an already existing polluting model. You don't have to look far amongst the entrepreneurial community to find acceptance that climate change is not just a problem, not just a threat, but an opportunity for new innovation, but also an appetite for new ways of working, for new ways of communicating in this, the most networked generation that there's ever been. And I see an appetite amongst many small startup businesses in Scotland for a different way of working, a more ethical way of working which treats staff adequately, which sees a policy like the living wage as an opportunity, not as a threat, not as something that's only a burden on the employer, but is a fantastic opportunity to make sure your customers have got some spare pounds in their pockets to spend as well. Businesses that see the living wage and abandoning practices like 0 hours contracts as a natural, decent way of working. Businesses also which are open to the idea of social enterprise models, of participation by workers in decisions about how those businesses are managed. A much less hierarchical, much less top-down, much less centralized model. And in spaces for collaboration. Spaces in which competition is not the only dynamic, but collaboration and sharing of ideas can cross-fertilize and make an entire sector much more productive and much more innovative. And we see this appetite, I see this appetite in many, many communities that I meet small businesses in, but I don't see it in what's being provided in business support services by government, which is only just beginning to hint toward ideas like the living wage, barely yet talking about promoting alternative business ownership models to small businesses and startups, which could be something that we find there's more appetite than we might imagine. And not really talking about those collaborative spaces, those collaborative networked ways of working, which will be the model, I believe, for the 21st century. So there's so much opportunity, a moment that's kind of febrile with the change that's already bubbling up. But I think the Scottish Government and the next Scottish Parliament needs to be bold in harnessing that energy and in ensuring that we're planning for a change of economic direction. And if we make that positive case for a stronger, more humane, healthier, and more sustainable alternative economic model, then we'll earn the respect rather than the contempt of the generation that's going to come after us. So the Greens, over the coming months, will be setting out the case that this change of direction is not only urgent, not only necessary, not only desirable, but is upon us already. And that those countries which capitalize on those opportunities, which realize those opportunities, which embrace the change that's coming, will be those that gain the most from that change. Those that resist and simply want to continue business as usual, those that simply want to prop up a failed economic model or a failed energy system for that matter, those countries will be the ones left behind. Scotland has been there before. We could have had so much better in the way of the high-value jobs from the wind industry, for example. We missed that opportunity. Other countries gained that benefit because we didn't get in there first. We're already seeing businesses in Scotland looking at the potential for oil and gas decommissioning jobs, and they're up against competition from other countries. And in some cases, these are companies which have no competition in Scotland, but their principal competition is from overseas or from south of the border. Don't we want to harness their opportunity? Don't we want to invest in the infrastructure they need, whether that's in port infrastructure, whether it's in energy infrastructure? Don't we want to invest in the skills that they need and give them the confidence that they need to build a reputation for undertaking that work as it grows? And the decommissioning work will grow substantially. Going back a little further, Scotland has been here with a wave of deindustrialisation that took place in very different circumstances for very different reasons. But again, economic change has to be an opportunity to look at what's coming next, not just to look at what's passing by. And it wasn't. It didn't happen. We didn't invest. I can join together with many across Scotland's political landscape in blaming countless failings by UK governments for not doing this. But the fact is it wasn't done. We didn't see investment in growing new sustainable industries for the future. We saw here today, gone tomorrow industries that never delivered the quality of life that communities need. We can't allow the possibility that we see that scale of economic change come past us again and fail to take the opportunities and be left only with the risks. And that change is already upon us. It's not only Greens who are making this case. Just recently, when the Scottish Parliament's Energy Committee took some evidence on the oil and gas industry, even the STUC and one of the trade unions representing workers in the North Sea itself were recognising that we need to start planning for the North Sea to have a shorter lifespan than previously thought. Their words, not mine. Now, if the trade union representing the workers most vulnerable to this economic change and most concerned about not just their short-term livelihoods, but their long-term skills that need to be retained in that sector, if a union in that position can recognise the need for a change of direction and for some economic planning to cope with this change and prepare Scotland for it, then the Scottish Government surely must acknowledge that this is time to take heads out of the sand. Only a transition away from that ill-fated over-reliance on fossil fuels can secure us a decent economic future. Now, the Scottish Government very often respond simply by talking about the amount of renewable electricity that's being generated, or that they have world-leading climate change targets, as though these in themselves are enough. They're not enough in themselves. They're good things. I voted for them as well. They're good things, but they're not enough in themselves. Certainly, climate change targets, if you fail to meet them, are not good enough. And renewable electricity, if it's adding to the grid and beginning to decarbonise the electricity supply, is great. But if we're continuing to be over-reliant on fossil fuels, and critically, if we're continuing to extract fossil fuels, then whichever country's carbon inventory that fossil carbon ends up on, in reality, it's going to end up in the atmosphere. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding that climate change is not a local or national issue. It's no respecter of boundaries, and it doesn't matter which country ends up taking nominal responsibility for the consequences. So even if we get back on track in Scotland, even if we get back on track after the extra 10 million tonnes of CO2, or the equivalent, that have gone into the atmosphere, given the targets that we've missed, even if we accelerate our efforts on climate change and give leadership around the world, even if we continue to develop renewable electricity and get beyond that into substantial renewable heat and decarbonising transport as well, and even if we achieve the economic change of ownership that could ensure the maximum economic benefit for the whole of Scotland, rather than swapping one bunch of fossil fuel multinationals for another bunch of renewable multinationals. Even if we do that, we're still only beginning, in my view, to gear Scotland up for the changes that are coming. And the phrase economic planning has been unfashionable for far, far too long. The mood that I want to leave you with before we go on to questions has to be about positive opportunity. It's not about whether we want these changes to be happening. They are. They're going to be a challenge to every country around the world. Many, in fact, don't have either the historic responsibility that Scotland has in having created some of the ideas that founded the Industrial Revolution, for goodness sake, in taverns and coffee shops up and down the Royal Mile and in university lecture rooms in this city and others. Not only the historic responsibility, but the chance to harness skills and innovation and renewable energy on a scale that not every country can manage. We're in pole position. We've got the opportunity to do something really transformational and ensure that we build that stronger, more decent and more humane economy. This is not just an environmental challenge, it's a social and an economic challenge as well. And there will be social, economic, as well as environmental opportunities. In the next session of the Scottish Parliament, some boldness is going to be required. Some bravery is going to be required. You know, Sir Humphrey always used to warn his minister that bravery was code for just don't bloody well do this, minister. Well, sometimes you do need a bit of bravery in politics, and the willingness to recognise that the way we've done things before is not going to last. I think ministers of any political party, whether they've got a majority in Parliament or not, ministers of any political party are at their best when they're being challenged effectively and expected to answer to the contradictions that may exist in their agenda. Pushed to go beyond their comfort zone. Greens have a track record of doing just that, not by saying that everything the government does is terrible, or that everything we say is wonderful. I don't think we try to take credit where it isn't due. But we have a track record of pushing the Scottish Government beyond its comfort zone on issues from a fracking moratorium, which Fergus Ewing clearly, fully signs up to, doesn't he? To issues like community ownership, where we've gained football fans the opportunity to buy their clubs in the Community Empowerment Bill, the beginnings of the opportunity for a fan's right to buy in football clubs. What better way to engage a community that may be interested in something quite other than politics, but to engage them in the sense that ownership is critical for the future of their own community. On climate change, certainly, not just on setting targets, but on getting closer to meeting them. On land ownership and on a range of other issues, I think Greens have a strong track record in this city and in others, including Aberdeen, where economic vulnerability is so much at the top of the agenda at the moment. The opportunity to have some degree of stability in the private rented sector, rental prices that people are being gouged with at the moment. That's a step forward that 2 years ago the Scottish Government said they weren't going to go anywhere near that. Well, they are now, thanks to pressure from us and others like us. It's really vital that the next session of Parliament sees strong, challenging voices, unafraid to say things that are difficult to hear, willing to give credit where it's due to a government when they do have something right, and to push them to go further. It's critical that we get that kind of dynamic within the Scottish Parliament. And just as I talked about the changing dynamic in the business world, away from a purely dog-eat-dog competition mantra toward a more collaborative style of working, a less hierarchical style of working, I think that opportunity to have a more collaborative style of politics is what devolution was always supposed to be about. You know, back when people were campaigning for and designing a Scottish Parliament, the idea was of a Parliament that would share power with the people. And there were some great innovative new ideas that tried to give effect to that in the early days. Well, they've gone a bit stale. We need to reinvent that sense of a parliament that shares power with the people and make sure that folk feel that the doors are open and that the place is theirs to participate in and that it's not operating as a political bubble. I think Scotland can achieve dramatic success in that democratic engagement, that social progress, that environmental sustainability, and a stronger, fairer and more decent economy. Scotland can do all of these things, but only if we grasp the opportunities of the changes that are coming about in the 21st century, rather than burying our heads in the sand and pretending that we can all just get back to business as usual. That's the challenge that I think the next Scottish Parliament is going to have to grapple with. And I very much hope that there'll be a good, strong bunch of green voices in there working to advocate that agenda and to push the Scottish Government, whatever its complexion, beyond its comfort zone. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So you're up for questions.
Yeah, do you want me to stay here or down here? Or?
Where are you most comfortable?
Well, why don't I grab a seat?
Right.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we now have some... No, I mustn't stand in the light. That's better. We now have time for some questions. There are microphones. So if you'd like to speak, would you ask a question, would you raise a hand, wait for a microphone to come to you, and then please say who you are before you ask your question. Thank you.
And be nice.
Start here, please.
Hi, Patrick. Lisa Stewart from Oxfam, Scotland. As you know, Patrick, at Oxfam, we are very focused on inequality and the link between extreme economic inequality and poverty. Some of the things you said there touched on inequality, and particularly right at the end there when you mentioned the need for Scottish Parliament to share power with the people. That's one of the things that we've emphasised, the need to address the inequality of power in politics. But I wonder if there's more you could say about how we can move from what is quite a positive narrative about inequality in Scottish politics, but that exists at quite a rhetorical high level, to really a reality of a more equal society in the next 5 years and into the future.
Thanks very much. It is going to be a serious challenge. Whatever happens with the Scotland Bill at the moment and the financial framework that's supposed to underpin that, we don't yet know where that's going to be, even by the time that dissolution hits the Scottish Parliament. If some arrangement is reached and that bill passes, then we're going to have the opportunity and the responsibility for all political parties to talk about how they can use tax and welfare powers in a more progressive way. People have talked about, whether to restore a higher rate for people on £150,000 a year. People on £150,000 a year are not the only high-paid people. If we want a more progressive form of taxation, we need to look at income, yes, across the scale, but also wealth, which, as we know, if we narrow the tax base just to income, we just open up so many more opportunities for the very wealthiest to shuffle everything over to the wealth side of their balance sheet and avoid paying tax. So there are opportunities, yes, on income tax, and personally I see no reason why somebody on my high salary shouldn't be paying a bit more tax. I give a substantial amount away to my party and to other causes that I believe in, and my income is still very comfortable. I don't see why I shouldn't be paying more tax. So someone on an MSP or an MP's salary, I think it would be reasonable to suggest that we have more progressive income tax. But we also need to look at local government taxation, which is a power we've had and failed to use since the beginning of devolution. The opportunity not just to have something that's not broken like the council tax, that's not fundamentally valued based on values that are meaningless now, so old they are, but actually one that creates economic powers at local community level. The opportunity to have economic policies that are right for the local context so that you can redistribute wealth where it's required nationally as well as locally. Tax avoidance is clearly something that we're not going to have specific responsibility for. And still, last week I was trying to move amendments to the land reform bill, which I can argue it's in the name of transparency, and the government will counter saying, no, you're trying to do this because of tax avoidance, and that's reserved. Well, look, if we're controlling how we register land ownership in Scotland, if we're in control of that, then we should be able to make some of these changes and ensure that ultimately land is not owned by entities registered in tax havens for their own self-interest. Whatever side of that argument you fall on, clearly we're not going to have adequate powers in the Scottish Parliament in the next session to have a proper programme on cracking down on tax avoidance. The very least we have to start doing is stop handing over public money to some of the companies and handing over public space through the planning system to some of the companies that are the worst offenders in what is now the standard way of big business operating, which is to ferret as much of our wealth away as they can in their tax havens. So, this is an agenda where there are some measures that we can take, some measures that we clearly aren't going to be able to take on our own, but should advocate for global action and EU-wide action. Hopefully an argument that will come out in the referendum, whether that comes in June or afterwards. And in the middle, there'll be some areas of slightly grey areas. I think the Scottish Government, to its credit, has sometimes shown itself willing to do things which are pushing the boundaries of what's legally permissible, like the minimum alcohol pricing. That kind of courage, that kind of boldness is required to push at the boundaries of what's legally permissible, maybe with some test cases. And I think tax avoidance might be a reasonable area to start doing that on.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman there, near the microphone, Stuart.
Yes, David Scott from Beyond. Patrick, in just about every climate change report I've read, usually buried away somewhere in Chapter 4 are a couple of lines pointing out that land use is a huge contributory factor to climate change. In fact, it's routinely stated that stock farming is causing at least as much harm as the whole automotive industry. Now, without debating the accuracy or not of that statement, why are we not seeing more politicians campaigning for a change in land use, a return to increased crop farming and the reduction in high-intensity stock farming? And that's not just climate change benefits we would get. A lot of the flooding would have been avoided, for example, in this. And I'm just curious as to why it's not something that's making its way onto the political agenda.
It's a very good question. I think sometimes the most difficult questions are when we're asked why we're not talking about something. The general attitude within this country and most Western countries is that such matters are for the market to determine and for public demand to determine. And I use the phrase economic planning, I think, 3 times in my speech. Economic planning is not the same as a planned economy. It's something perhaps in between the extreme free market model that we are moving in the direction of at the moment and the other extreme. But we, I think, do need government to take responsibility for the consequences of the impacts that economic activity have, and not simply say that it's for the market to determine or for supply and demand to determine the level of economic activity which will have profound social, environmental and health consequences as well. And when we talk about what food we're going to produce, we can't detach that from the health consequences. And yet, at the moment, we do. Agriculture policy is barely even talking to the part of government that's considering whether to have something like a sugar tax or other public health measures. So why we're not talking about it, I think, is partly due to the impact that a very free market model has on politics, on closing down debate to the ever narrower range of issues that that are supposed to be democratically accountable. Huge chunks of what should be democratically accountable power in our society have been handed over to the markets, and a great deal of our political landscape thinks that's as it should be. And I think you, Lisa, I think used the word power in your question as well, about sharing power. When I talk about sharing power, I'm not just talking about democratic power in parliaments, I'm talking about economic power as well. Is that getting anywhere close to an answer?
I know Caroline speaks very, very strongly on this issue in England and Wales. I would just like to see it spoken about more openly here in Scotland, and perhaps the Green Party might be at the forefront of such a debate.
Well, I'll certainly take that away, and thank you for the comment.
Thank you. Let's move over this side of the room.
Hello, Elizabeth Meehan. I enjoyed your talk very much. You touched upon the EU in discussion of tax avoidance, but and maybe I should know all this already. But what is your reaction to the Prime Minister's renegotiation efforts, and how would the Green Party campaign in the referendum in Scotland?
The Scottish Green Party passed a motion, I think unanimously, at our party conference last year, which said that we'll campaign to stay within the EU, but that we won't take part in a coalition campaign that involves the Conservatives. And that's not entirely about being partial or regarding the Conservatives as toxic, because the Prime Minister, you're right, is leading that negotiation. I think he's leading it in a direction which is entirely at odds with what I think Europe is good at. I think Europe is good at social and environmental protection. I think Europe's at its best on some of those issues. And the kind of Europe I want is not the free market, money knows best agenda that I think the Prime Minister has in mind. But it's also critical that this debate, this referendum, isn't seen as a contest between a free market EU agenda and a free market outside the EU agenda, between Nigel Farage and the Tory Eurosceptics on one side, and David Cameron and the likes on the other. This has to be about the social Europe, the progressive Europe, the environmentally responsible Europe, which has achieved a great deal, I think, when it's been allowed to, and could achieve a lot more on something like tax avoidance, on ethical business. It's moving in the right direction, while the UK is moving in the direction of turning the City of London into a tax haven. So, I think staying within that is going to be important. There will be some Greens who will take the other view, and I respect that, and I'll respect their ability and freedom to campaign for that view. But I do think they're a very small minority within the Scottish Party, certainly.
Thank you. Yes, here at the front.
I'm Joe Elliott, trustee of the David Hume Institute. I'm curious about your prospective use of the pricing mechanism in introducing renewable energy in substitution for fossil fuels. When we had high oil prices, then it was difficult enough to make the case, the economic case for renewables without subsidies of various sorts. But always the hope was that the cost of renewables would come down and the subsidies would no longer be required. But now that oil prices are lower, then it makes that even more challenging. And I'm not sure if we play through the scenario of a pricing of a carbon bubble. I'm not sure what that means in terms of actual oil prices, and presumably, if there's on that analysis, in some way, it's made uneconomic for people to take oil out of the ground. Otherwise, they would just carry on doing it, even though it would be bad for the climate. So how do you see all this coming together to actually make the economic actors bring about the decarbonisation?
It's a very good question. The impacts of low oil prices or of high oil prices at other times are complex, and those impacts are not just good for one person and bad for another. That's much more complicated than that. So the importance of the oil price globally is so high that it'll impact not just on the incentives for investors to look at renewables, but also for them to look at fossil fuel itself as something to put their money into, and will make, as your question implies, some fields less economically viable, will make other fields close down earlier than they would have done otherwise. And even if the oil price was to rise again in future, it may well be that skills and infrastructure have been lost to a certain extent, and that those fields are not going to come back. Now, from the point of view of wanting to keep fossil carbon in the ground, at a simplistic level, that might be a very good thing. But it doesn't help to ensure that there is incentive to invest. Something like the really profound opportunities Scotland's got from wave and tidal, which has taken longer to materialise than had been hoped, was never going to deliver on a short timescale. I think it's bizarre that anyone imagined that the private sector on its own would do this. I think that the kind of change that is required, because it is long-term, and because there will be a long lead time between investment and commercial payback, I think it requires state action. I think it's inevitable that it requires state action. And very often, even the political right wing understand that state action is necessary sometimes when markets aren't enough to bridge that kind of gap. Now, at the wave and tidal side, we've seen the beginnings of a recognition that the Scottish Government has a responsibility, creation of Wave Energy Scotland, taking some intellectual property into public ownership, but only with the same short-termist attitudes that the UK government has taken to the banks. Instead of using that public ownership of banks as a period within which to create a genuinely sustainable and community-owned banking sector that other countries enjoy, they're just trying to put banks back on their feet again and shove them out to the private sector again. Well, I fear the same thing is happening in the Scottish Government with the wave and tidal energy industry, where it's something that's been taken grudgingly into public ownership in order then to commercialise it as soon as possible and put it back out to the private sector. We've got this strange attitude to ownership in this country, which I don't think left-wing people or right-wing people should be happy about. The notion that the public sector takes ownership of things that fail and lose money, I don't think even if you're right-wing that should be seen as a responsible use of public money, and that as soon as anything's making a profit and is viable again, it's pushed out to the private sector. The private sector's repeatedly failed with the East Coast rail line. And yet, as soon as it's profitable in the public sector, it's pushed out to the private sector again. Royal Mail was brought into a position of being commercially profitable in the public sector and then privatised. Prestwick Airport, for goodness sake. Scottish Government took public ownership of Prestwick Airport because it was failing. And as soon as it becomes profitable again, they want to privatise it. I think we need a much more balanced sense of ownership in our society between public community ownership, which could be a dramatically bigger part of our economy, and responsible private ownership. Now, if we had that, then I think we'd see a much greater range of different incentives at different times for people to invest in something like the transition to renewable energy. Take housing, for example. If you've got a new development or a major refurbishment of an area, an estate that a housing association might have ownership, for example, they don't have the money to put in the really high energy efficiency kit or the decentralised micro renewables, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's solar, whether it's combined heat and power, whatever the technology is, they often don't have the money to invest that up front. Well, if you have a local energy company, as this country used to have, and as a lot of other European countries never gave up, if you have a local energy company that can use the borrowing power of the public purse, which can borrow more cheaply than the markets can, to invest in that extra upfront kit that can go into the built environment, and be the local energy provider for a fixed period at least, so that you can recoup what you've borrowed over 5 or 10 years, and then after that, you've got the cheap energy that's being generated. That's the kind of local investment that can result not only in decarbonisation, not only in recycling money within the economy, but also at the end of the day, you've got something which is a community-owned asset, which is benefiting people in the economy right directly in the local economy, rather than benefiting the shareholders of some remote company which may or may not be based in the Cayman Islands.
Yes. Lady here.
Anne Packard, you referred to the difficulties facing Aberdeen. Could you say, please, what 5 things, on what timescale, you would do in Aberdeen to help the city move forward in the face of the oil and gas downturn?
Well, certainly the city deal, which has been talked about of late, we argued from the word go of debating that kind of agenda that it had to be about investing in alternative economic industries, in long-term jobs, in reskilling people, including ensuring that young people, apprentices coming through, are being trained up for the long-lasting industries rather than for an industry which is in terminal decline. We need to also ensure that we retain some of the skills in the supply chain which will be relevant to the renewable energy industries, whether that's offshore wind, whether that's marine wave and tidal, and also the subsea electricity infrastructure that's going to have to be built across the North Sea to connect our country's grid up with those on the other side of the North Sea. A lot of these skills in engineering terms and in the wider supply chain are relevant now, so we need to be retaining those. So those are the principal priorities for investment. And I would certainly be arguing for the ending of tax breaks for new exploration and investing that money instead in retaining what we have now. If we focus on getting over a shorter time period, over a 10 or 15-year time period, getting out of the North Sea the fossil fuels, the hydrocarbons that we can afford to burn in the long term, and make sure that we're using the revenue from that to invest in the transition, then we have a path out of this. But if you're handing over effectively tax breaks to the industry for new exploration, when we already have more oil and gas than we can afford to burn, then we're simply digging ourselves deeper into a hole. So I think shifting that money from tax breaks to the industry to retaining the skills, the economic activity that is going to make sure that skills are kept in the sector and kept in the region, and make sure that the revenue coming into the public purse is invested in those alternative, longer-lasting industries, and actually set things like the what do they call it? The Energy Jobs Task Force, they call it, doesn't have a focus on looking at the decommissioning opportunities. It's being told that decommissioning is something for the distant future. There are decommissioning opportunities right now, and we're in danger of missing out on them. So we should be looking to expand that kind of activity and make sure that we don't find ourselves in another 5 or 10 years' time with countries in Norway or wherever having built the global reputation that they're the guys that are good at this kind of stuff, and that we miss out on that.
Thank you. Yes. Sir.
Hi, thanks, Patrick. Bill Roger. You've used the word community and community ownership quite a lot there, Patrick. I welcome that. I suspect that most people in this room get a warm feeling when they hear it. I wondered if you could put some more specific indications around that. What would constitute a community in this Scotland of yours if you were to achieve a majority in Holyrood? And what powers would you be prepared to devolve in the knowledge that, of course, sometimes these communities would want to do things that you may not necessarily agree with? How far would you go with that? And what does such a community look like?
Well, this morning I was in a muddy field in Glasgow called the North Kelvin Meadow, which was never built on. It was a playing field long time ago. I think during the Second World War, housed barrage balloons that were there to protect the BBC during the war. And since not long after the war, it's been basically neglected and dilapidated, left kind of ramshackle by Glasgow City Council. Glasgow City Council would often argue, or its predecessor, that they represent the community. They're the democratically elected body, that they represent the community. But the actual people who use that site, the people who live in that neighbourhood, they would call themselves the community, and they're the ones who had to walk past it when it was basically a rubbish dump for years. They were the ones who had to walk past the sheds on it that were vandalised. And they're the ones who said, we're not putting up with that. If the council won't do anything about it, we will. And they put, over years, they put their time, their energy, their creativity into that site. And it's gorgeous now. It's a beautiful, creative, educational, sustainable and productive space where people who otherwise wouldn't have any chance to grow any of their own food, other than what they could manage to, a few herbs on a tenement window box or something, they've got space, they've got ground, they've got raised beds that they can grow food and meet their neighbours and walk the dog and sit in the sun. That's something that's been created by the community. And I think the act of that creation should give that community a right to say, we are the community that's created this. We are the community of that space. And sadly, that lovely community space is, if the City Council has its way after today's planning decision, is going to be bulldozed and built on. Not for housing that community needs, but for housing that community couldn't possibly afford. Community isn't only one thing. I don't think there's ever going to be one simplistic definition. Some of it will be about space, some of it will be about identity or culture, and it'll operate at different scales. At the moment, though, there's very little opportunity for communities to have any formal expression of themselves in the democratic process in Scotland. Even within those planning decisions, one member of that community could have been elected to the local council purely on the basis of a single issue campaign to save North Kelvin Meadow, and as soon as they'd been elected on that basis, they'd be forbidden from taking part in the planning decision. Because of course the planning system is still principally a relationship between developers and a quasi-judicial authority. The community itself doesn't get a look in. Community isn't only one thing, and I'm not going to try and pin down a single definition. It needs to be something that has the power to create itself. And yes, to do things sometimes that I might not like. And if a community is equally creative in their opposition to renewable energy, I need to respect the fact that they have that view. And I will want to convince them, and I will want to try and find out if some of their neighbours have an alternative view and also want to be creative in putting forward what they want.
Yes, please.
John Brand. Patrick, thank you very much. That's very interesting. As you pointed out, we tend to denominate our ideas of energy production in terms of electricity produced and electricity used. And I'm sure you're familiar with David Mackay's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. In that, he points out that actually the energy that we use as electricity in Scotland, say, is actually about 4% of the energy that we're using in reality. The other 96% is on things like getting around, heating houses, and so on. A lot of it we export, in fact, by getting the Chinese to make our fridges and things like that, so it doesn't come up on our energy bill, so to speak.
I think if you're including all of those induced emissions from consumption, from imports, as well as food, then yeah, it's probably about right.
Yeah. So it's just conceivable, I suppose, that we might make enough electrical energy in Scotland with windmills and wave power and so on and so forth to cover that 4%. But how about the other 96%? I'm guessing that you are not a great fan of nuclear energy. Where's it going to come from?
Yeah, I mean, on the electricity side, yeah, I don't think Scotland needs new nuclear. I don't necessarily think we even need to extend the life of our existing nuclear. I think we can let that tail off quite naturally. I think given that the focus of the grid is shifting in the direction of a much more of a kind of networked relationship where you have more interconnection, where you have more storage on the grid, where you're not thinking that you have to produce all of the electricity that a place uses in that place, but there's more of a kind of open network. I think the electricity is perhaps the least challenging of the wider energy system. You know, some of what the chap in front of you, sorry I've forgotten your name, was talking about that in food production is directly connected to that energy balance, either in terms of where hydrocarbons come from and where they go to, or indeed the energy that's used to create a very intensive high meat and dairy diet that's very successful at killing people in the West. So the challenging concept that we have to get to is making less feel better and feel enough. A great many areas of public policy are more of policies. If you talk about health or education, then you want to provide more nurses, more teachers. If you talk about criminal justice, you want to provide more bobbies on the beat. If you transport, I think, is the same. When we talk about transport policy, very often it feels as though most politicians want to build you a new road or want to build you a new rail line. But whatever it is, it's more of. And I think we need to get to the point on things like transport policy and others where we think of them in the same way as energy efficiency in the home, the same way as waste management and the circular economy, where we're not talking about just providing more of, we're talking about what we need to live well and how that can be achieved with enough. And I think the obsession with GDP also, which I only touched on, I think I talked about that a little bit more last year, but I only touched on it in the opening remarks. The obsession with GDP as this single overriding metric that was never intended to be the only test of whether an economy is healthy or not, but it's become that. It's come to be used in that way. That, I think, drives people toward the idea that more is always necessary, and to think that enough is something you can never talk about. Actually, Oxfam, the Humankind Index, was a very good attempt to come up with an alternative set of economic indicators, and they didn't just do that with a bunch of academics in a room. Where academics involved, that's okay, but they started with the question, what do you need to live well? And they took that question out to communities around Scotland. And very often, a lot of the answers, yeah, there were answers about having money, there were answers about having material stuff, but that was all framed in terms of having enough. It was not aspirations to kind of football player salaries. It was about enough. And I think a lot of people understand the concept of enough. And a lot of economists and politicians and, dare I say it, finance secretaries don't. So, I mean, that takes us a wee bit away from the energy system, but I think that question of enough and sufficiency has to be where we get to on energy, on transport, on a whole host of the economic and social processes that consume energy. We have to be talking about enough rather than just more of.
Yes, gentleman centre back.
Yeah. Well, you can. I'll put your hand up in a minute. Sorry, yeah, David Gow from Skeptical Scot, the online magazine. Very interesting you talked about economic planning, but in Scotland, for the best of my knowledge, not many people talk about this bit of economic planning, which is the planning for the society and work which will be brought about by robotics and by artificial intelligence and all those things. In other words, there are various kind of studies being done, and a lot of this is being done, for example, in Germany, where they call it Industry 4.0. where the government has, the German government set up a whole series of task forces with industry, unions, and various other people. Basically, some people think that as many as up to 50% of what are currently classified as middle-class jobs could disappear. And I don't get the impression that anybody here, you know, a lot of, for example, people doing legal work will no longer be necessary. People like myself, journalists, could well be, it's already happening actually, to some extent.
Don't say it'll happen to legislators as well, please.
Well, not yet, but who knows, could be replaced by algorithms.
Yeah.
That is already happening.
Yeah.
But nobody here talks about it. So that seems to be, that would also be part of the transition which you're talking about, to rightly, to a post-carbon economy. Why don't we talk about it, and do the Greens actually have any attitudes or policies which they can bring to bear to this, what I think should be a kind of very important debate?
You're quite right that I could have talked more about it. I talked a little bit about the kind of collaborative economy, the sharing economy. I could have talked more about that as well. I think these are very connected things. And this incredibly networked generation, the generation of, you know, the 2-year-olds who are finger painting on iPads, the stuff that they're going to be capable of doing that I can barely even imagine. Will they have the opportunity to do it? Will they have the kind of economy that puts their skills to use, their human ingenuity and creativity to use? Or will they be living in an age where that human potential is no longer a marketable commodity because you know, so much can be done with artificial intelligence, algorithms, and so on. And as well as that, the big data agenda, which we have had some good attempts by some of the Scottish universities to research into this and to develop ideas about it. And the Internet of Things, obviously, this kind of slightly amorphous concept, which is growing, which is going to leave the idea that the Internet was all about cat videos looking a little bit passé very quickly. It, again, could be an incredible transformation that unleashes and harnesses human potential and creativity. The idea that we live in an age where the entire human population has instant access to the entire sum total of human knowledge at the touch of a screen should be something profoundly, historically inspiring. If what we end up with is the chance that a great many people find themselves on the economic scrap heap and unable to have the wherewithal within their lives, the decent baseline quality of life in order to make use of that potential, that would be a tragic missed opportunity. I think the critical issue that I would offer from the Greens policy platform on this is the citizens' income, because a more collaborative economy, an economy in which more people have unstable incomes or who spend more of their lives working for themselves or with a wider range of income sources from different forms of lateral economic relationships rather than just that hierarchical economic relationship of employer to employee. In that kind of economy, if that is what emerges, having that baseline, having a welfare system which says everybody, as of right, as a human being, is entitled to enough to have a decent quality of life. And I use the word enough, I try to underline that, having enough to have a decent quality of life. And, you know, if you are the kind of person who wants to spend your life chasing more money on top of that, you might have the opportunity to do that. Most people are not motivated exclusively by money. And if you're the kind of person who's motivated by creativity or by the relationships you have with your friends and your family, or by, you know, turning a neglected gap site into a beautiful meadow in the north of Glasgow, those are of economic value as well as social value. And having that baseline to ensure that the wealth of our society is shared sufficiently that everyone has enough, that citizens' income, as opposed to the very means-tested approach that we have to welfare, I think that would be the critical aspect of that. And I think it's an idea, it's by no means a new idea, and there are other advocates than Greens, but I think it's one which will be very, very compatible with that, that more lateral and potentially more insecure economic landscape that people may be living in.
Thank you. And you have the microphone, sir? Yes. I think this will have to be the last question. We're running out of time.
Okay, apologies to the others then, Chair. With your agreement, Chair, can I raise 2 points, quite diverse, but I'm sure Patrick will deal with them very quickly. My name's Bill Howitt. Patrick, very good wide-ranging presentation, particularly at the sort of geopolitical and strategic level. It was a bit light on Scotland's future in a post-carbon economy, but we'll let you off with that. It's been very enjoyable. Two very diverse points. One, you emphasised many times about markets driving, market setting, particularly in terms of energy policy. Last week I listened to a discussion on BBC Radio, 4 eminent people, experts on energy generally. They had quite diverse views in the future. The one thing they all agreed on was that, particular at the moment, oil prices and in future energy prices will not be set by markets. They're being set politically. I'd like your comments on that, and what does it do to your theories? The specific point is you made, I think, a mistake by suggesting you would come into Scotland to any council area where people were rejecting renewable energy and convince them. The council of which I was chief executive was Western Isles. Would you like to go up there and convince them to take those giant wind farms?
On the latter point, I don't think I said that I would. I think I said I would try, and I would certainly try. And I think very often one of the things that does put people off wind developments in their neighbourhood is the feeling that it's in somebody else's interest, that it's not in the interest of them, their community, their neighbourhood, that it's land that they don't have a direct economic interest in, and that it's an energy business that's going to be owned by somebody else, and they'll be left with the impact of it, but they'll get none of the benefits. And I think what you see in some other countries where public or community ownership is much more natural and normal and is a much bigger proportion of the energy system, is you see much less, not no opposition, not no hostility, but much less. And that the balance of public views is more in favour of seeing this in the community's interests. As for who's setting energy prices, there's a danger that if we begin talking about the politics of the Middle East, we'll be here till, well, the end of the evening wouldn't be nearly enough. Clearly, some of the aspects of what's happening at the current time are about short-term interests and the political interests of governments like Saudi Arabia. I think it would be wrong in some ways to classify the Saudi government as the public sector. It seems to me a wholly owned private entity, and so I think what I would like to get towards is a situation in developed democratic countries where we recognise that the community, the widest community, as well as the smallest, most local community, has a right to exercise economic power and has a right to hold accountable those who it permits to exercise economic power, whether that's in terms of the energy industry, the food industry, whether it's in terms of the huge number of sectors of our economy in which a tiny number of multinationals crowd out genuine diversity. I was watching a program the other day about a community of small local businesses that had a go at taking on the multinationals in the way they use tax havens. I hope they were doing that to point out the unethical nature of it rather than to succeed in reproducing it. But the notion that our high streets have been cleared almost entirely of their genuine, authentic, bottom-up diversity in the interests of a tiny number of businesses that dominate, whether it's in banking, whether it's in energy, whether it's in retail. I want to get to a position where it's not so much a kind of left versus right ideology, but a sense that a community has a right to exercise its own economic power and to determine its own economic future. I don't think that's something so much to ask for, really. It doesn't feel as though that should be something impossible to achieve. And I think this bizarre aberration that we've gone through over the last few decades of clearing out communities of their own economic power and their own agency will come to be seen as a mistake.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. Can I hand the chair back to Ray Perman, please?
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Can I, on your behalf, thank Patrick Harvie for his speech tonight and also for answering questions so frankly, and Dame Jocelyn Bell-Burnell for chairing so well. Just before we end the formal part of the evening and invite you to network with us later, can I just hand over to Edward Duncan of the Young Academy of Scotland, just to tell us a little bit about the work that they're doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, just for a couple of minutes at the end of what's been a really stimulating and enjoyable evening. I'm here to spend 2 minutes to tell you about the Young Academy of Scotland, which is part of a global network of young academies which exist, possibly the least known of the supporters of the series of events. The Young Academy of Scotland was founded in 2011 and currently has 151 members drawn from an interdisciplinary base of academia, both in sciences and the humanities, as well as from business and, importantly, from the third sector as well. Our remit is not small by any manner of means. We aim to actively shape the future of Scotland and beyond. Now, whilst I'm unable to draw on the inspiration of St. Augustine, like Patrick did earlier this evening, I can perhaps look to an 11th century French proverb which says that Rome wasn't built in a day. And certainly in the last 5 years, I don't think we can claim to be actively shaping the future of Scotland and beyond, at least not yet. But we do have a wide range of very active and involved working groups drawing on education, industry, looking to open data, as well as health and well-being. And some of these are making great strides and great connections in Civic Scotland and beyond. Perhaps just to tell you of one thing which we've been involved with, some of you may know of, and if not, some of you may like to go home and look at, a website and blog service called Research the Headlines. Now, Research the Headlines is a series of blogs made up by members of the Academy, which aims to challenge media portrayals of research. All too often you see dramatic and misleading headlines and misleading narratives of research which claim to make great strides or claim to have great woes that are forthcoming for us. And often the research and the evidence don't support what happens in practice. Research the Headlines aims to debunk some of these issues. To give you two contrasting examples, in recent months we've looked at issues to do with the refugee crisis, to challenge some of the myths around whether or not Scotland and indeed Britain has capacity to take on more and what the economic impact of refugees would be, saying that we should indeed be welcoming more to the country. Then looking at something as diverse as are skinny jeans bad for your health, which the mass media would have let you know at a certain time a few months ago was an impending health crisis. Now, I don't wish to make a judgment on how many of you are wearers of skinny jeans, but for those of you who are, you can rest assured that the evidence is very limited and your health status is perfectly safe. The most recent activity of the Research the Headlines group has been a competition called Rewrite the Headlines, where they've gone out to schools and engaged schools in a really exciting project to get children to begin to look critically, and young people begin to look critically at the way that media portrays information to them. And there's been a competition with schools to get them to rewrite the headlines. And in fact, on the 29th of January in Dynamic Earth, the winners of that competition will be announced. So fantastic things happening, interesting things happening. Keep an eye out for the Young Academy of Scotland. If you haven't looked at Research the Headlines, it's researchtheheadlines.org. I think you'd find it very informative, and thank you for this time. It would be remiss of me now not to say that we're all very welcome to go to the reception outside. Thank you.